my honor to introduce to you Professor Khan, who is at Wayne State University as an associate professor in Near Eastern Studies and director of the Center for the Study of Citizenship. Along his area of focus are to educate citizens about the new technologically interdependent world and establish public policies related to citizenship in the United States and globally. May I present to you Professor Khan.
Thank you, and good evening. I'm stunned at the attendance, and I'm humbled by the fact that you would come out on a Tuesday evening, but then you're not competing with a Dream Cruise or a Tiger Game, so that helps. But I also am not so hubristic enough to think that you came here for me. You came here for the topic, and it is a topic that is dear to all of us. Thank you to the League of Women Voters, particularly for giving me the exemption. I mean, I'm a voter, but, you know. I think about a day like today with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, and I think about the idea of causation. Historians are notorious for considering cause and effect. People tell you it's all about analogy, that, well, this is like this and this is like this, but actually you have to look at what are the causes that then create the effects, which I think provides more accuracy. And when it comes to the 19th Amendment, not only was it the work of the indefatigable suffragettes and others who were allies, but I think it's also important to locate 1920 within this broader historical recent arc of World War I. Now, World War I, you're probably wondering, what would that have to do with the suffrage movement being successful in the United States? Anyone want to hazard a guess? No? You didn't think this was going to be a quiz, did you? Yeah.
They helped the war effort.
They did. And they, by they you mean women? Yes. Okay. But it's not just the fact that women helped in the war effort, it is how they helped. Society actually changed here in America because of the war. America gets into World War I, according to Legends of the Fall, in April of 1917. A little bit late to the game, shall we say, and partly because the war was really being waged elsewhere than the United States. But what that meant, that as Johnny went marching out to war, who was going to then replace males in what were seen as traditional roles and occupations? And women were then designated to go ahead and take those roles. And believe me, at that time, there were probably more than a few incidents of resistance, shall we say, maybe even defiance. People saying, oh boy, here we go. Women are now in these positions, whether it is bank tellers or others outside the traditional realm of what would have been seen as domestic. And people thought that this was an existential threat to the fabric of America. But guess what? When the war ended, America didn't. And the idea that we were able to find a social transformation that not only did not undermine the foundations of American society, it actually improved it. And so I think it's quite telling then to see the cause and effect that sometimes an issue as grave as a global war plays in then producing something that serves as its catalyst, which then becomes what we now have today, very fortunately, the political enfranchisement of 51.3% of the American public. I'm always fascinated when I see these kinds of correlations as to how they then germinate, because they come about sometimes so unexpectedly. And I think that that's a really good place for us to start today when it comes to the idea of democracy, because democracy, when it came to the suffrage movement, meant that the pedal had to be pressed down by the foot without really any kind of relenting from that. The idea that so many were involved for so long in bringing about the change that now we can certainly enjoy and from which we benefit, was something that did not require passivity, and it did not require anything short of full commitment. And now we have to ask the question, in 2025, 249 years after the inception of this country, whether we as a body politic have felt that it is okay to take the foot off the pedal. And I look back at, because we have to blame something. I would say we have to blame our own success in the Cold War. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed when our presidents had different attitudes toward Russian leaders. And and I think that as America became not only the sole superpower, but with the end, or the seeming end, of the project of Marxism, the project of communism, that liberal democracy prevailed. And to borrow from the political economist scholar Francis Fukuyama, we were at the end of history. He borrowed from Hegel. He did cite it, so don't think he plagiarized. And he was saying that we really cannot improve upon what now is a template and a model for all time and for all people. And that is the kind of Western liberal democracies which were forged in the crucible not only of us here in the United States, but throughout Western Europe. Well, that was a book in 1992. Fukuyama very graciously has admitted, oops, maybe I jumped the gun. Because now we find that there are several interventions of democracy, some which some would argue are perhaps an improvement on the American model, some which, ironically enough, are actually maintaining those pillars of democracy, perhaps better than we are. And at the same time, we also have to recognize, at least on a global level, that democracy is being challenged. And we see this happening every day in places like the United Kingdom. We see it happening in France. We see it happening in Italy. And we see it also happening in some of those new countries that came on board after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the promise and the dream of democracy was something that was bestowed upon them, particularly, shall we say, east of what used to be known as the Iron Curtain. Remember that, folks? Yeah, I use that term in my classes. It goes nowhere. They also don't know who are John, Paul, George, and Ringo. I don't know which makes me sadder. Maybe if I was more like my hero, John, I'd tell him. But we can talk about academic freedom on campuses a little bit later. But what I find, though, is that we are at an inflection point when it comes to how we see democracy and whether democracy is something that we have really taken for granted. Certainly, as you might remember watching Schoolhouse Rock, there were plenty of indicators, there were plenty of reminders that democracy was something that defined us as a people, that defined us as a nation. And perhaps we have to revisit what were the central ethos of Schoolhouse Rock. And I know now I've put several earworms in your head about I'm Just a Bill and all of those others. Please feel free to sing along. Well, the Brookings Institution has identified 7 pillars that are necessary to defend democracy. To put it in another way, that means that these are 7 pillars that are being challenged when it comes to democracy today. And by the way, this is not intended to be by any means a partisan lecture. I, like the mayor of Verona, will say a pox on all your houses, because this isn't something that began either in January or in January of 2017, and that's why I wanted to at least locate somewhere 1991 as being this moment when we could say that we had reached an exalted high, but at the same time, whether we were really coasting or whether we were in fact starting to slide is something I will leave to your interpretation. Protecting elections, defending the rule of law, fighting corruption, reinforcing the civic and media space, protecting pluralistic governance, countering disinformation, and making democracy deliver. Now, does anybody have issues with these as pillars when it comes to democracy? Okay, well, we're all on the same page with that. How many of you think that one or more of these pillars is currently being challenged? Oh, so basically all the people that aren't members of the League of Women Voters yet. Got it. Okay. Sign up. If you're not from Oakland County, I'm sure somebody will take you in. So, well, let's go ahead and start with some of the challenges then that we see. Hot off the presses. Redistricting the congressional map. As you know, every 10 years, in years that end in a 0, we have the census, in which we are able to count how many people are in the United States. After that, nerds like myself will go through pages and pages of data, looking up demographics, trying to figure out trends and trajectories. Some of it actually comes in very handy when it comes to allocation of resources as well. But there are others who look at the census and perhaps have a different perspective on what to do with the data, including trying to then take advantage of how geography can go ahead and inform their ideology in shaping the map of their respective states, particularly when it comes to congressional districts. And here in the graphic, you see the Lone Star State of Texas. And as you're probably well aware, over the last several weeks, there have been efforts made, instigated by President Trump himself, trying to nudge Texas to reshape the congressional map so that for next year's midterm elections, there will be a quantitative advantage for the Republican Party to maintain its majority. If they are to tinker with the board, so to speak, speculation is that they can pick up an additional 5 congressional seats, which, of course, given the precariously thin margin that we have today at the Capitol in Washington, is quite significant. Currently, there is a congressional district, mind you, that includes Austin. Anyone been to Austin? For anything other than the tacos? Which, by the way, is reason enough to go, okay? I was there for South by Southwest, which was wonderful. I was invited to moderate a panel back in March, and I was really excited because I thought, wow, I'm here, and at my off time, I'll be able to see all the great music, except that I didn't have that kind of pass to get in. I had a pass to get into my own talk, but that was about it. John Fogerty and a bunch of other artists were there, but I got to hear them from outside. But there's a congressional district in Texas which then has to go ahead and offset, apparently in the minds of the Texas legislature, of Austin's, shall we call it, fairly blue concentration. And the district actually extends out 300 miles on a very narrow line, which wouldn't even require a whole lot of skill for a colonoscopy, to get to where the other area is to mark off and offset with red population. As you know, some state legislators from Texas decided, well, we're going to go vacation in Illinois, because, you know, that's always everybody's aspirational goal. But to get away from then having quorum to allow for the vote to go forth, And as you recall, there were then all kinds of efforts to bring them back. They have come back, and now I believe that they did have the legislative session, and they did go through with what they had planned. But wait, there's more. America's a far bigger country than that, and coming to the rescue of maintaining balance, apparently, in the universe, we have Gavin Newsom's yang to Greg Abbott's yin. Now saying, well, let's see what we can do with our congressional map in order to then go ahead and bring back those 5 seats and maybe a couple of more. There's 48 other states, folks, and I don't know where this ends. But the bottom line is, irrespective of whether one sees oneself on one side of the political aisle or the other, the net result is the disenfranchisement of people in their role as voters by then stacking the deck one way or the other, which the last time I checked was not only undemocratic, but probably anti-democratic as well. Now, the president has said, I'm going to sue California for what it's doing because this redistricting and gerrymandering is so wrong. For those of you who might be familiar, every Friday morning I do a podcast for Deadline Detroit called The Week That Was, which is a weekly news roundup. And one of my assets, apparently, that keeps me coming back and keeps me endeared to the host and the panelists is my proficiency in Yiddish. And boy, is that chutzpah. The audacity to go ahead and call a spade in one state and not another, I think shows the kind of frustration and worse, the disillusionment that then people have toward democracy. And I think that scratching one's head can only occur for so long before one throws up their hands and says, can we not do better? And the reflection comes back and says, not really right now. Part of the American system, and any 5th grader will be able to tell you this, is that America is predicated on a system of checks and balances. And even if the executive branch is, shall we say, having its own definition of fun, there ought to be at least the fidelity of the other 2 branches to do something about it. And it seems as though right now the legislative branch, when it is in session, which it currently is not in session, has ceded its role of being the check and the balance on certainly the executive branch and to a certain degree also on the judicial branch. With that shift toward perhaps party over structure, we are certainly in the positionality that we find ourselves. This also, of course, is the case with the judicial branch and the Supreme Court of the United States, but also all federal courts. And the news came down today that a federal judge, and it's always interesting to see now in the media, do you remember a time before that judges were always identified by whom was their appointing and nominating president? Now it is pretty much right after the lead. And so, quoting verbatim from the news item, a Trump-appointed judge went ahead and dismissed the lawsuit that the White House had filed against a clutch of Maryland federal judges at the district court level who had apparently voted, or I should say held, in a way that was unparliamentary to the president. So at least I suppose we can say that there was some holding the line. But of course there are 2 more levels to the federal judicial system. There is the appellate court system, and then of course there is the Supreme Court. I know most of you here, if not all, remember a world that I would call PB, pre-Bork. Once upon a time, Supreme Court justices would be nominated and would then be approved with unanimous consent. These would be votes that would take up as much bandwidth to the United States Senate as passing a resolution or a proclamation with my name on it. Boy, do I miss those days. It seems as though since the Bork nomination, we have just simply had one contentious nomination process after another, whether it was Bork or whether it was Ginsburg, not Ruth Bader, the other one, Lani Guinier. We have had, certainly for those who want to watch things with more bells and whistles than boring C-SPAN, fireworks in the Senate chamber over these. We saw this with Clarence Thomas. We certainly saw this with Kavanaugh. Squeeze not here, is he? Okay, just checking. Neil Gorsuch to a certain degree, Amy Coney Barrett. And the pendulum swings in the other way. Notice how nobody talks about law review articles anymore. No one talks about publications. No one talks about actual decisions that came down that were decided. For those of you who've been to law school or you just do this as a hobby, some of the Supreme Court decisions that have been written in the past, and unfortunately now in the distant past, are pure prose. They are literature in the finest order. People like Judge and Justice Learned Hand, Louis Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter, even Anthony Kennedy more recently, Whizzer White. These were talking to us as a public about who we are as a public and the values of what is our supreme authority, which is the United States Constitution, was being interpreted for us to understand us better. I'm not sure that in the last 10 opinions that I have read from the Supreme Court, one can say that is still true. And perhaps it's just simply a reflection of where we are as a society, that an academic journal article and a TikTok video in transcript form are given equal footing. We also have something that, again, I'm sure many of you had not thought you would see in your lifetime. How many remember 1968 Chicago? The album? Okay. Back then, I think they were still the Chicago Transit Authority, by the way. Have any of you seen the trial of the Chicago 7? Okay. Non-members, you can vote too. Okay. I watched it again a few weeks ago, and God bless Aaron Sorkin for his writing ability. Superb, and we've seen this with The West Wing, and we've seen it with Newsroom, and so we've gotten fairly acclimated to it. But the dialogue of people like Abby Hoffman, who I was fortunate enough my freshman year in college, he came to Michigan, and I got to see him speak. Any of you play tennis? Any tennis watchers? Yeah. You guys remember Bud Collins with the very flashy pants? Used to be the announcer on NBC. Bud Collins was, in one of his past incarnations, the men's tennis coach at Brandeis University. And one of his players was Abby Hoffman. I'm thinking it must have been a really big sweatband that he needed to have, given that really impressive hair of his. But the dialogue between him, the dialogue of Tom Hayden, and what they stood for and why they stood for it, from the standpoint of being American and putting it out on the line, even when you had Judge Julius Hoffman, who saw things quite differently, almost seems inspirational in times when democracy is challenged. But today we find something quite different than Mayor Richard Daley deploying the National Guard at the time of the Democratic National Convention in the streets of Chicago. Things are quite a bit different from the horrors of Kent State 2 years later. Now we find, interestingly, and perhaps for some worryingly, the invocation of laws that were really, in a sense, still on the books but kept dormant. One of them is the D.C. Home Rule Act, and the other is the Posse Comitatus Act, which says very specifically that the military shall not be deployed, and certainly against American citizens on U.S. soil. That support level has now been eroded. And has anyone been to Washington in the last 10 days? Okay. Good, I guess. But if you didn't get to Washington, it may be coming to a place like to Chicago. And I thought that it was quite interesting that Mayor Mike Duggan felt the need to say almost preemptively that the crime rate in Detroit is down, and that the reason that the crime rate is down in Detroit has something to do with Donald Trump. Is that then statistically accurate when it comes to nerds like us who look at causation, or is this putting the red blood on the door to let the 10th plague go by? Sorry for getting biblical on you on a Tuesday night, and these are the questions that perhaps we should be asking, but I can tell you that they're questions that certainly the media should be asking as well. And we'll talk more about the fourth estate in a second. This one cracks me up, but not in a funny way. We had Elon Musk come in with Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, and essentially with a very broad brush pen start to lay off people under the guise of shrinking the government because it is bloated from the standpoint of both bureaucracy and expense. I used to go to the State Department to provide consultation, and I did so under the George W. Bush administration, and I did so under the Barack Obama administration. Maybe once under the Biden administration. The door didn't knock but the first Trump administration or currently. Who knows if it'll change. But one thing that I do know is that several people with whom I've interacted over the years, who were what you call career bureaucrats or officials, are now out of their jobs. And with that, then, we have the phantom limb of subject matter expertise. I mean, I'll tell you, things weren't great under George W. Bush when it came to that. I remember giving a talk after the fall of Fallujah in 2004, and I was at the Office of Policy Planning, which is the think tank inside the State Department, and I gave a 45-minute talk on how Fallujah and Anbar province was Shia, and how Baghdad was a mix of Sunni and Shi'i, and how the Kurds were in the north and they were Sunni but not Arab. And at the end of it, one of the officials raised his hand. He says, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure, that's what I'm here." He says, "So you're telling me that the Sunnis and the Shi'is are not the same people?" And I thought that my mic must have been off for 45 minutes, except we were in a small conference room with no mics. And it just occurred to me the dangers of bringing in political appointees or people without subject matter jurisdiction or expertise, or in the case of this gentleman, being a Nepo baby. So if you don't know what a Nepo baby is, your grandkids do. Sort of a political favor. I find that the impact on democracy of this may not seem apparent because we don't, of course, vote for the officials, and particularly those who are in positions for 20, 30, 40 years. But what we do is we vote for those who get to appoint political appointees, and then now, what seems to be the case, make decisions that are discretionary, that seem to be also arbitrary and capricious in removing people that seem to be inconvenient. Ostensibly inconvenient because they get a paycheck, but also perhaps ostensibly inconvenient because they may share an ideology that is not congruous to the White House, or that they share an ideology that might challenge what the agenda may be in the rest of the executive branch. We also find my home away from home, universities, and the whole threat to academic freedom. I may be very naive, but I remember when I started teaching in the area of higher education, borrowing from another great Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, the whole idea about speech and how speech was paramount, almost a cardinal virtue. And speech was presumed to be protected, particularly the most nefarious, the most obnoxious, and the most rude of the speech. That no longer seems to be the case, and a lot of decisions that are made on campuses to determine what then constitutes problematic speech is not necessarily based on what case law says from the Supreme Court regarding the First Amendment, but is governed by market forces because the threat of losing budgets, losing funding, losing government funding has now had what the Supreme Court called in many of its speech cases a chilling effect. And so the solution then is to just simply say that the sun is shining all the time. And that doesn't do much for perhaps what is another hallmark feature of not just we as a nation, but we as an informed electorate, having the ability to think critically. And what we find then is the abdication of thinking critically is not only happening in this particular plane, but also thanks to something which I was mentioning just before we started. I actually had to spend 10 minutes in each of my 3 classes yesterday, because the term began at Wayne State, trying to discourage, implore people not to use ChatGPT, to use AI for help on their papers, or to be inspired, or just give that nudge to get going on an essay. Because every time you ask ChatGPT, it's like asking, I suppose, and you guys remember this, the old magic 8-ball? Except now you've got a magic 8-ball which will spit out a full paper with citations. And I said, if I wanted to read that, I'd do it myself. And then I tell them I did do it myself because I rinse all my exam questions and essay questions through ChatGPT to see what it's going to spit out. So right now I'm still probably about maybe half a step ahead. But when you find the convenience of simply hitting a button, and now of course many of these AI assistants are incorporated into search engines, you have to wonder then, is there a correlation between that and taking your foot off the gas pedal in making certain assumptions and presumptions that democracy will always exist, as it has and as it should? So something to go ahead and consider. I promise you I couldn't find a different graphic than this, but it's kind of funny in an ironic way. Media self-censorship, censorship as a whole, and what I would call the inaccuracy of the media makes democracy an even bigger challenge than all of the other factors that I have mentioned. Once upon a time, the press was free, the press was vigilant, the press was notoriously contrarian to the status quo that was being disseminated by other corridors of power. And now we find a quiescence that is unprecedented. We find a media that in many ways is conflicted. For example, who owns the Washington Post? Jeff Bezos. Thank you. It's no longer Catherine Graham. Hasn't been for a while. And Bezos, how many, okay, I'll ask the question, not because I want to get you to do me a solid, but how many of you have Amazon Prime? Okay. As many as the non-members so far. I see a correlation. Well, what is Amazon Prime up to now? Is it $159 a year? Okay. Still cheaper than a day at Disney? Okay. Well, all of the people who are Amazon Prime subscribers are not the reason why Bezos got married in Venice. The money that Bezos makes, where it's really about money, is with government contracts, including Amazon Web Services. And of course, you see this also with his nemesis, shall we say, with Elon Musk, and with many of the other tech giants who seem to also have interests and stakes in media, whether it is in traditional media, whether it is print or broadcast, or whether it is in the new realms of social media. It's remarkable to hear young people come up to me and tell me that they get the news from TikTok. And I don't know whether to be chagrined or depressed, or in some ways saying, you know, given how the regular media is today, as somebody who was running for office once asked, what have you got to lose? Because it seems as though it's certainly more convenient. You watch a 30-second video of TikTok and you are spared having to read laboriously 3 or 4 books that might provide more nuance and texture on these areas. But somebody recognizes that, and I did go and do some due diligence on some of these social media sites. Democracy is not as championed as the latest fashion by a Kardashian. I didn't mean to rhyme there. Okay, fashion by a Jenner. And it seems as though then there is a kind of narcotic effect on the idea of how democracy impacts everybody. I am thrilled beyond words to see all of you here today. I wonder, where are the young people? I'm not saying you're not young. All I know is that's the closest exit, and I do want to get out of here. But where are the younger people? Yes. All of you would be, for me, what we would call non-traditional students on campus. Okay. But the recently matriculated, shall we say, I think it then speaks volumes to where is the appetite and where is the need and the sense of inquiry. I don't want to use the word anxiety, and I don't want to use the word urgency. That's a more subjective thing, and we can certainly argue about that. And then we find religion in the public sphere. The president apparently is looking to sign an executive order to ban flag burning, which, according to Texas versus Johnson, has been, even if one finds odious, is protected speech. That case is 39 years old, came out in 1986. But now there is this idea that given how the Supreme Court no longer holds the concept of stare decisis to be sacred, reverence for past precedent. And we saw this, of course, with the overturn of Roe versus Wade, but also, if you recall, in the opinion by Justice Samuel Alito, that we need to go back to a time of what America's traditional values are. That's not exactly a very safe space for democracy, because traditional values in that sense means pre-19th Amendment and probably pre-13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment as well. So when the support is not there, we have to then wonder, where then are the pillars for democracy? Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, has demanded that every school classroom have a copy of the 10 Commandments posted on the wall. This despite the fact that he violated commandment number 7 on more than one occasion. I'll let you look it up. I can tell you that this is my 50th year living in the United States. I migrated here from Great Britain, which explains the accent. And I grew up in 3 metropolises: New York City, Houston, and Lapeer. And at no time was my religion a contested issue. I remember my senior year of high school, we had what was known as baccalaureate. And baccalaureate was actually a religious service. I went, when I was in England, the public schools were really all governed by and administered by the Church of England, so I knew the Book of Common Prayer backwards and forwards like any good Anglican would. But that didn't help me with the demographics in Lapeer. I went for the simple and sole reason that you could get your yearbook quicker. and that was worth going to praise Jesus. But the idea then that somehow the values of the United States from its inception are going to be relitigated and re-legislated because of anxieties that people have, that somehow the other, whatever dysfunctionality they may feel about the United States, cannot then be addressed through the democratic process, is certainly problematic. And when you have some notion of history, you understand that America actually has never been a Christian nation. Here's a question for you. Upon what, and I'll do the Jeopardy sound too, where is the authority to say that the United States is not a Christian nation? Not just when it comes to the First Amendment. Where else? Thomas Jefferson, the letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. Right? I'm sorry, but you're wrong. Yep. Please keep laughing, though. It's infectious. The letter that Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association has no legal binding authority. But I'll tell you what did. The Barbary Treaties of 1796. By the way, advanced question here. What was the first country to recognize the United States? France? No. Was that? Oh no, Liberia was founded by slaves, and that was much later. Yeah. But you're on the right continent. Come on, there's only, I think, 37 other countries. Morocco. Absolutely. Morocco was the first country to recognize the brand new United States of America. Well, in 1796, John Adams, and you may have missed this when Paul Giamatti was playing him, had the Barbary Treaties. And in clause number 11, it says very clearly that the United States are, back then they used the word are, not is, are not a Christian nation. Now, how does that then determine the fact that we are not a Christian nation? Because the Barbary Treaties had to be ratified by the United States Senate. And when they were ratified by the United States Senate, they then bound the United States to the treaty and all the provisions in it, including the declaration that is in there that we are not a Christian nation, quod erat demonstratum. It's really interesting that you have to plumb the depths of finding that. And maybe we should go ahead and issue the citizenship test to everybody in America, not just those of us who came over. But I think that some of these fundamental understandings are now actually being challenged. I gave this anecdote to somebody, and they said, "You're making up the treaty." I'm like, of course I did. I just went on to ChatGPT and said, give me a treaty between the United States and Morocco and backdate it to 1796. But that's one of the other challenges that we have, and certainly we have it to democracy. And then, of course, we have ICE detention of not just criminals who are undocumented, not just undocumented people, not just legal immigrants, but also U.S. citizens. And what seems to be rather harrowing here is another hallmark of the American legal system seems to be dismissed, neglected, and ignored with impunity. And that is the great writ of habeas corpus. We know that in the Civil War, it was suspended by then President Abraham Lincoln temporarily. I'm not sure what's the war that we're fighting today that would justify the suspension of habeas corpus, but it seems to be something that occurs without any challenge. And maybe we are just simply inundated and deluged with so many challenges to democracy that we simply have lost the bandwidth to consider them. I mean, I know it may not be your favorite writ, but it's somebody's favorite writ, and it seems as though somebody would be speaking up with more fervor and stridency about trying to protect it, preserve it, and at the very least, have it used properly. Well, all of this talk regarding the challenges to democracy are in some ways both real, but they're also in the abstract until you put actual data down on what we could see and then extrapolate to be the effect of all of this. A few weeks ago, there was the mayoral primary in the city of Detroit. Mary Sheffield was quite happy. I think that $5,000 from Samuel L. Jackson clearly put her over the top. Candidate Don't Know came in second, and then you had Solomon Kinloch. I thought that the top two vote getters were supposed to then go on to the general election in November. So Kinloch kind of got a pass, it seems. But look at the percentage of the voter turnout. Under 17%. Now, we could go ahead and come up with any number of rationalizations and excuses and say, well, it's an odd number year, and I'm just hardwired to go ahead and only vote in even number years. I don't know if the election cycle ever ends in America anymore. It usually begins the very day after the previous election. But by all measures, the percentage is shockingly low. And one has to wonder then that next year, when we do have the midterm elections, and there's going to be a bigger ballot with more stuff on it, whether this is going to improve much. I can tell you that the midterm elections have seen quite a steady decline in voter turnout, well under 50%. People definitely do get agitated enough and exercise enough to invoke their rights as citizens when it comes to the presidential elections, because you have, of course, a full ballot then as well. But democracy is not something that does or should go dormant in years that are seen as inconvenient. And particularly when now there are proposals being made to abolish mail-in voting. That, of course, always mystifies me as the child of two democracies who has the ethnic heritage of one that's been trying in Pakistan, teetering between democracies and dictatorships for so long, that there should be an easier access for us as citizens to be able to exercise our right. The calumny of saying that mail-in voting is something that the United States alone does. Anyone want to take a guess? We can round it out to tens. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, 34 countries, including the United States, have some form of mail-in voting. In Australia, it is mandatory to vote. You have to cast a ballot. You can fill in your own name or that of your favorite marsupial, but you have to vote, because that way there is no ambiguity or contradiction about the fact that you were able to exercise your rights to vote. So I see then voter apathy actually being voter disillusionment. People wondering, does it matter? Now, some of that could be because the system is perceived to be gamed. Some of it is because, particularly since 2010 and Citizens United, the amount of money that has come into the system, where in the wisdom of the Supreme Court, and by the way, that wisdom was in italics because I was being sarcastic, that somehow the other money is equal to speech, and therefore there is no limit on that kind of speech because it is political speech. That's a whole lot of judicial gymnastics at work. Almost as good as saying corporations are citizens, but that's for another time. So then what do? We as an American people, as an American public. I think that, and I hope that this will serve as a good launch point for a very robust Q&A session, and I invite you to have your questions come up to the front so that you're writing on the cards. I see this as being another set of threes. We have the three branches of government, which ostensibly should be well balanced. They should check one another, and more importantly, they should be separate to each other. Well, we have three somewhat permeable concepts here as well that are interrelated, as they should be. We have politics, we have policy, and of course we have popular participation. All three are required, all three are realities when it comes to democracy. The third one, popular participation, is very, very contingent on the other two. Unfortunately, what oftentimes happens is that people feeling as though they're political animals is not necessarily political participation. They're not even at the zoo. It takes something more than simply betting on a horse or championing someone that echoes what they believe is a prescribed set of values, which may actually, if they plumb the depths of them, not really match up very well. But then there's this third branch, which is policy. And I find that when I speak to people who are disillusioned with our democracy, it's because they don't understand that policy making plays such a big role. Now, some would actually argue, and I would beg that they didn't, consider policy making to be synonymous with the deep state. I'll tell you another story about the State Department. I, as Michael Corleone would say, am part of the same hypocrisy. I used to think when something was happening in Washington that didn't quite add up, there are people who are literally going back 100 years and wearing mustaches that they're twirling. I know mustaches are coming back, so for anyone who's got one or wants to grow one again, you're going to be hip again. And I would think that there was something nefarious going on. But in my experience being at the State Department, I said, what's keeping me up at night now isn't that there are a bunch of insidious people in Washington. I realize that it's not insidious, it's incompetent. That for them, policy making is actually something that is not very refined. And part of that is because the vigilance that is really for us as the popular participants is not there. How do we get there? Part of the solution is to demand of politicians that they, who are closer to the policy making, pay attention to this and realize that that is another element that we will consider when it comes to exercising our democratic rights. Now, I want to end on just one anecdote because for some of you it's so good to see so many of you from other places like the Society of Active Retirees. Thank you. I'm a fan of TV. I'm less of a fan of TV than I used to be because I find a lot of what's on TV now not really enjoyable. But how many of you ever watched The Crown? Excellent. I was watching an episode the other day, and it was about, in the 1960s, Harold Wilson, who was the Prime Minister, the Labour Party. and how his policies were seen as problematic by some very powerful sectors of British authority. A major newspaper editor, media, the Bank of England, finance, and a quisling from the monarchy itself, Lord Louis Mountbatten. And they actually got together over, I'm sure, champagne and oysters or something hoity-toity, to instigate a coup against the Prime Minister. Thankfully, the Queen was apprised of this, and she interceded, even overriding her own great uncle, Louis Mountbatten, and uncle of her own husband, Prince Philip. Boy, I miss the Queen. I do realize, though, that the British system is different, but I also realize that in America, after fighting to get away from the monarchy, we are the gatekeepers and the vanguards to prevent another monarchy from occurring here. Something to take away from the crown as well. Thank you.